Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's Dialogue Conspiracy number 306. For those of you that keep the tape and number the program, and this is January the 29th, 1978. I wrote down 1976. It's really 1978. Last Sunday night, I sounded tired. I was angry when I came in about matters pertaining to the work, and I probably shouldn't have carried it over into the program, and I was exhausted about problems, again, related to the research that have affected me earlier in the day. A hassle which I may share with you sometime on Dialogue Conspiracy, but right now I'll keep it under the covers for a while. It's something that's been on my mind for almost a year. And when I've had a year of it and I'm fed up, I'll share it with you because I'm really disturbed about some problems, and I'll go over them with you. But as Thomas Paine said, those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigue of supporting it. And believe me, there is fatigue sometimes related to the work. The Nazi race war phone messages were upheld in the Texas Appeals Court. I don't know if any of you knew that this was going on. In Houston, Texas, the American Nazi Party has been sending telephone messages asking for a race war, offering $5,000 reward for killing non-whites and Jews. A radio station managed by a Jew, Marvin Zindler, prohibited this advertisement on the air, and there was an $87,000 suit against Mr. Zindler and the television station. The appeals court has said that they can go ahead with their message calling for the all-out war against Jews and non-whites, and the prize is $5,000 to kill such persons. And then the court said that if this incites violence and a crime is committed, then you can take it to the courts and punish them later. But they can offer the bounty, and unless it goes to a higher court, that's one of the decisions that came down this week. I finished a small section of an article for We Magazine this week. They asked me to send them a list of witnesses to the John Kennedy assassination that have been killed since November 22nd, 1963. I don't believe they realized how long the list would be. It totaled 241 persons. In the next few weeks on Dialogue Conspiracy, I will read some of those to you. These were pertinent witnesses that I know died of suspicious circumstances, and as I said, my total was 241. They also are taking out of their files the interview that Paul Krasner did with me a year ago. It was titled The Mind of Mae Brussell, or Who's Afraid of Mae Brussell? And We Magazine was afraid of Mae Brussell. They took the article and paid for it and put it in the drawer, and now that Paul has become the editor of Hustler, they've resurrected this article, and they won't send it back to him. He wanted to buy it back from them, and they refused, so it will be a print in about 2.5 to 3 months, so you'll be able to see an interview that I had with Krasner. And it's a very good interview into, again, the theme that I keep talking about, the Nazification of America and the links of Nazis to the John Kennedy assassination and other conspiracies in this country. They also want the story of the killing of the rock musicians that has bounced back and forth. I told you Paul Krasner wanted for Hustler, but I refused to give him anything because of his working with Mark Lane and Dick Gregory. And as soon as I refused to do that, 2 days later I got a telephone call, and Hefner, Playboy, We Magazine want the story if I'll give it to them. So there are a lot of outlets for publishing these stories, and I'm holding my guns to my position with Hustler, and I always will until something drastic is changed there. I did finish a short article from Malcolm Abrams for Midnight that'll be on the stands. I get telephone calls and letters from people wanting things that I'm writing and working on during the week, and sometimes they come and go before I get a chance to tell you. The byline, always at midnight, that you can get at drugstores, Thrifty, and Safeway and grocery stores, is always under Malcolm Abrams. And on the John Kennedy story, it's my article. He asked me to support the new evidence coming out of the FBI files. There was a document that Gerald Ford was the spy on the Warren Commission, reporting back to the FBI about the meanness of the Warren Commission. And of course, I told the people at midnight that Gerald Ford was the spy for the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as the FBI. He was the supreme spy on the Warren Commission, and I listed 29 categories where he assisted or committed a crime of cover-up and infiltrated and purposely distorted evidence serious charges against Gerald Ford, just working on the Warren Commission, not covering up Watergate, but just the Warren Commission. And, of course, Midnight simplifies their articles into about a half a page or a quarter of a page, so I think they used 6 examples, such as the leaking of the diary to Life magazine, the July 10th issue, 1964, Lee Harvey Oswald's diary, and the fact that the original diary doesn't exist. Nobody that I know has seen it in the last 14 years, and the link of that diary to Gerald Ford and his creation of this Lee Harvey Oswald as being a bumbling idiot for the news media. His responsibility was to cover for both the FBI and CIA so that nobody would believe that Oswald could be an agent of either agency because he appeared stupid. And a lot of that cover-up was directly responsible Gerald Ford. That will be out within a week or two, and you can get that article. And I also did the interview I mentioned last week for Conspiracy Digest, and you can write to Mr. M.C. Alpine and ask for that section. You can subscribe by the year, $15 a year. It's a marvelous quarterly. I just can't recommend it highly enough, and it's full of information. Or you can get seasonal sections, and they're $4.95, and that's P.O. Box 766. So I will be having these 4 publications coming out, and you can pick up the written material and see how I've been working during the week when I'm not on the air on KLRB. On television this week, there's 3 important programs in the local area. You can pick them up, and if you get tapes of this show, by the time you get these tapes, these are series, and you can pick them up in your local community or follow the reruns if the beginning parts play again. One is on KQED called The Prisoner, and next week is the second section of this Prisoner. It's 8 o'clock on Channel 9, and this is the story of an agent of the CIA who wants to retire, and he's gassed and put into a village to live out his life. And they ask him what he remembers of his former assignments or why he wants to retire. And the series, I believe it's 17 or 18 weeks, and it's about how they force him to talk. And there are various people in this village that are allowed to live there, some very happy and allegedly normal, and others are obvious surgical robots. And the degree upon which they treat his mind, I guess, is in proportion to how much he can tell. It's important, and as I say once before, it was like the Borgia stick, the movie The Borgia Stick, of what they do to these agents. Now, when I look at the list of people that have been murdered who had evidence of the Kennedy assassination and were witnesses to the assassination, there's a large number of them that are CIA agents and FBI agents, and it seems that their mind control village, if it exists, doesn't exist very well, because it seems that it's just easier to shoot them out in a hunting field, such as William Sullivan was killed. Many of them are just gunned down and shot or poisoned. The mind control system may be working for some of them that we don't know about, but evidently the gun seems to be an expedient way to get rid of a lot of the agents, and it's used. I'm breaking the category of witnesses killed into the ways they died and their professions, and charting them and graphing them out, these 241, and that'll be interesting, and I'll share that with you when I get that done. Another television show is this coming Tuesday, January 31st, and this is a new series. So if you get the tapes and don't get this Tuesday show, because tapes of this show next week, be sure to watch it. It's called The Fall of the Eagles, and it's a new series on the fall of the Habsburg family, the Hohenzollern, and the Romanovs. I always have trouble pronouncing that. And it's described as, in quotes, the intrigues that caused the great European dynasties of Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia to collapse after World War I. Now, this is a series on these families, and of course the question arises, did the dynasties decline, or did they just keep changing hands after World War I and II? Are the manipulators today a rerun of the eras of before linked to those families? I believe they are, and I've had guests on this show several times, Lydia Blades, who studied these families in this era extensively, and she believes they are. And the new order that has taken over when they were out isn't much different. People such as Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands represents the royal family there, and Mr. Brzezinski represents the Tsarist Russians, and Henry Kissinger, the German aristocracy, and our country is very much in control of these people who, on the surface, were kicked out as the heads of their government, but run our National Security Council, our banking houses, and our policies. And then Saturday night on KQED, again, From 8 to 9 p.m., they're running a series called World War I, which is a very simple title. I watched last week's story, and it's fascinating. But this week they're going to have this section called The Fall of the Royal Families. And again, it goes into the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, and it gives an hour's view of these families dressed up in their feathers and finery, looking very festive and regal, just at the collapse of World War I. And it's a good chance to get an education into the era that is shaping our destiny now. And you can see these pictures and then follow it up with books and study this history, and I think it makes it easier to understand the present conspiracies. The paper this week was filled with articles about J. Edgar Hoover and James Earl Ray and Jack Ruby. I just brought in a few headlines, and maybe in a few weeks I'll go into detail about them. There's a New York policeman who retired from the police department named Patrick Murphy, who is writing a book called Commissioner, and in it he says that J. Edgar Hoover was the Rasputin of American law enforcement, and he goes into the abuses of J. Edgar Hoover. Another article are FBI documents released that were compiled while J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, saying the FBI claims that James Earl Ray, who killed Martin Luther King, was a lone assassin. And then it tells about James Earl Ray's plans to go to Rhodesia, his Nazi feelings, a non-specified amount of money that he had, that he was heavily involved in drug traffic while in prison, and had money while in prison. And he went to Chicago after he got out of the Missouri jail before he began his course of losing his traces and then finding himself behind the Lorraine Motel when Martin Luther King was shot. Chicago comes in the news with the story of the FBI funding 5,000 agents. They gave them $2.5 million, the same FBI, between 1966 and 1976. The FBI in Chicago got $2.5 million and had more than 5,000 spies. And of course, this is the era in 66, 67, when James Earl Ray was in Chicago, when E. Howard Hunt was in Chicago, when the Nazi Party was retrenching and getting stronger. They've been very heavily formed and armed ever since World War I in the Chicago area. In 1968, during this era, we had the Chicago riots, the time of the Democratic Convention. Jack Ruby had a lot of contacts in Chicago, and earlier in Chicago in 63, there were plans to kill John Kennedy just a few weeks before he was killed in Dallas. The FBI has put a lot of money that they've admitted, and goodness knows how much went to James Earl Ray to help him get onto Canada once he had left the Missouri penitentiary. Well, the headlines tell you on one page, you open the newspaper and it says James Earl Ray acted alone. You open the next sheet of paper and it says new angle on Martin Luther King's death. The House Committee in Washington, D.C. has subpoenaed Mr. J.B. Stoner because Stoner says the FBI offered him $25,000 to have Martin Luther King killed and $2,000 to blow up a church in Birmingham, Alabama. Mr. Stoner has been attorney for the brother of James Earl Ray. They worked together, worked with the Ray family, and he's now under indictment for the Birmingham bombing. He's free on $10,000 bond, and he's going to talk about the offer of the FBI to kill Martin Luther King. So it's interesting that while the House Committee in Washington, D.C. in January 1977 is asking Mr. Stoner about the FBI offering him $20,000 to kill Martin Luther King, and the FBI admitting by their documents that they don't know where James Earl Ray got the money, you can see that one sheet of paper, for example, in one day has one story, and then you turn the page and you get another story, but the facts remain that there was a lot of money spent for counterintelligence, and within a few years you will find that both the FBI and the CIA played an important role in the killing of Reverend Martin Luther King. The New Times Magazine has a long article that was reproduced in today's Chronicle, January 29, 1977, the San Francisco Chronicle, and New Times Magazine on Jack Ruby and the secret life of Jack Ruby, having to do with Santos Tropicana, Sam Giancana, Frank Sturgis, Frank Perini. This isn't a secret life of Jack Ruby. All this information was available in 1963 when the Warren Commission was doing their work. They could have found all of this out. It's taken 14 years to get the kind of researcher committees going that will admit, even in the San Francisco Chronicle, the links of Jack Ruby to FBI and the CIA. But if it takes another 14 years, we're ready to do it. The researchers are ready to stay with it and expose it and prove to you that the Central Intelligence Agency and the President of the United States and the Supreme Court and the FBI and the local police department all worked together with organized crime and killed these people in the 60s and 70s. And believe me, the truth will come out. There's a little more every day. In fact, there's a lot coming out. And so every time you see a cover-up article, there's 10 more that prove, even today, how the major media is lying. And there will come a point where they won't keep repeating the cover-up because they'll have to face the facts. Well, for the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about the Buckley family because, as I said before on earlier shows, you can order these books. I had reprints made. It's put out by the National Labor Caucus, and they're $2. And it's an outline of the Buckley family and their role with the intelligence community in promotion of fascism in the United States. I mentioned earlier, a couple of weeks ago, about William Buckley, the father, who worked in Mexico in 1908 to 1921. He worked for the Rothschilds, the Royal Dutch Shell Oil, and helped overthrow the government over there to put a puppet government in that would be supportive of the oil interests in Mexico. I'm quoting now direct quotes from research done from the National Labor Caucus Committee. The booklet is put out by them, and I feel that a lot of what they say on this thing, as far as I could research it, is accurate, so I'm quoting directly from it. They said the Buckley father was the chief liaison for the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company and Standard Oil. And then in 1952, Mr. Buckley Sr. went to Venezuela to open up the Panapec Oil Company. That's the oil company that George de Morenchild worked for, Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA babysitter. In 1958, Mr. Buckley Sr. died and left a fortune of $110 million for his family. And they formed a corporation with interest, Panapec Oil, and other concessions in Australia, Greece, which was overthrown by the CIA military coup, the Philippines, which is much controlled by the CIA, Guatemala, which is totally controlled by the CIA, Florida, which the government in Florida, colleges and media and the officials of the Florida state are practically all supportive of intelligence operations of the CIA. And then they have interest in Wyoming, Libya, and Israel. The Buckley family had 3 children that were active in intelligence from 1950 to 52. They were recruited. One is William Buckley, the columnist and radio announcer. The other is F. Reed Buckley, and one is Priscilla Buckley, the sister. It was a large family, but they named these members of the family. E. Howard Hunt was recruited by William Buckley as soon as he was sent to Mexico to set up their CIA stations. E. Howard Hunt said, "The first person I thought to bring in was Mr. Buckley, and he accepted immediately." Buckley set up the Rockefeller Covert Action Organization, and it's the thesis of the National Labor Caucus that there is no faction split between the extreme right and the Rockefeller faction. That the purpose of the Buckleys was to take the Joe McCarthys and the Goldwaters and make them look very far right so that the Rockefellers would look liberal or left. Whereas the Rockefellers really were the links to the Nazis, to Odessa, to the Interpol, the international police that were formed by Adolf Hitler. And that the Buckleys used this right-left faction through National Review and through the news media by promoting the very far, far right and creating that term military-industrial and avoiding references to Rockefeller. It made it look as if there was a division between them, and there wasn't. The purpose of the Buckleys, this research group said, was to set up networks ever since World War II, to set up covert operations, such as the secret army organization in France and the Cuban exile paramilitary and the Latin American death squad. William Buckley and his family are major officers in the Rockefeller Nazi connections and have organized underground the funding of the Weather Underground, the Japanese Army, and the Black Liberation Army. That makes sense when you read of the conventions and the RAM studies that terrorism will bring fascism to the United States. We're reading this over and over again, that we must almost accept fascism because as a result of terrorism threatening us. The article goes on to say that the Buckleys were useful to Interpol, the international police organization, and they coordinated with the Nazis, the fascists, and created what we call that left-right network. They set the basis for the Versailles Treaty negotiations along with the Rockefeller Combine and Allen Dulles. In Spain, after World War II, F. Reed Buckley was the liaison with the Franco regime. And this was the headquarters of Dorothy and He Howard Hunt in Spain, if you remember. It came out at the time of Watergate, and also of Mullen Associates, an office in Washington that had a large connection to Spain. They worked with SS Colonel Otto Scarface Kerensky, that's Hitler's Gestapo, the SS, through the Spanish headquarters, whose son-in-law was the financial technician Hjalmar Schacht. He was the former head of Hitler's Special Operations Team, and these people worked with the Rockefellers and Buckleys and the Hunts. They go on to say that F. Reed Buckley, William Buckley's brother, and there's James Buckley in the Congress, was also in constant contact with the Vichy war criminals. They set up the assassination teams against Charles de Gaulle, and they promoted Anti-Pavlik, the butcher from the Nazis who formed the Ustashis, famous for their terrorism in Yugoslavia, the secret police that are now working also in the United States with hijackings and various bombings. The assassination team that killed Charles de Gaulle was the same assassination team that killed John Kennedy, funded by Permindex. So if Everett Buckley was working with those teams, then he was also working with the team that arranged the assassination of John Kennedy. William Buckley Jr. helped Howard Hunt weave all the Nazi elements into the Latin American CIA division, and their headquarters were in Mexico, he says, and William Buckley had constant contact with Nazi organizations in Spain. It was the Buckley's job to help E. Howard Hunt weave these elements in Latin America, the CIA division, into a private network. William Buckley Jr. was in constant contact with top-level State Department people, with ultra-secret meetings of Interpol and Kerensky and the Nazis. In 1952, William Buckley retired from the CIA. He retired in the same fashion that E. Howard Hunt retired from the CIA in 1970 and shows up at the time of Watergate working at the offices of the CIA for Robert Bennett and Mullen Associates. The purpose of retiring was to set up a deployment network to invade Berlin for the uprisings, to set up Nasser in Egypt, arrange the coup in Iran in 1953 with Mossadegh out and the Shah of Iran in, arrange the coup in Guatemala in 1954. Buckley remained the head of this Nazi Interpol network. He traveled with the CIA agent Lieutenant General Vernon Walters, his name service at the time of Watergate, who worked closely with Richard Nixon through his entire political career up through Watergate. They traveled in Greece, where they set up Nazi networks and later assassinated Richard Welch of the CIA. They were in the Caribbean, where they visited Orlando Bosch's group and set up the network there, and in Chile and in Spain, worked on the Iberian Peninsula and Latin America. They set up death squads in France. I have a series of articles on a group called Tradition, Family, and Property. He claims that the Rockefeller, Buckley, Nazi, Interpol combined set those up, and they set up the Argentine death squads that continue to work, both of them, all of the time, killing all chance of any socialist form of government or changes in society. Brazil and Argentina are sealed as fascist states for, it seems like forever, just as Chile is now, and they set up the killing of Allende later, too, but this is an early period. And then Buckley, after leaving the CIA, retiring in 1952, played a very important role in founding a magazine called National Review, and he worked with people like Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles and Henry Luce. And when he came home from Mexico, he used the National Review as a network to reach out and promote certain politicians such as Joe McCarthy, who would appear to be, as I say, extreme right. He even goes into the fact that Joe McCarthy caught on suddenly that members of the House Select Committee on endowed foundations were linked to a web of Rockefeller network. And this study goes on to say that the reason Joe McCarthy had the rug pulled out for him was that he was catching on to the conspiracy of the Rockefeller brothers. When he was looking for communists, he was catching the Nazis and the Rockefeller network. So they had to get rid of Eugene McCarthy, and they did in a very cruel and unsubtle way. Brent Boswell, who's the brother-in-law of William Buckley, married to his sister, joined with National Review and became an important controller of the political career of Joe McCarthy. Did I say Eugene McCarthy? I might have. It's Joe McCarthy, of course, but sometimes I say Eugene. I mean Joe, through this Cold War period. The National Labor Caucus says that they used him as a psychological warfare mouthpiece. He would talk about preventive wars against Korea. He carried on an anti-communist crusade. And Brent Boswell, the brother-in-law of the Buckleys, was a ghostwriter for Joe McCarthy through this period. They promoted him and set off a Red Scare through various books. And the right-left faction began with McCarthy looking so far right, as I say, that Rockefeller looked left. And their purpose, the purpose of National Review was to make Rocky and George Bundy in that group seem liberal and sensible. And this is a direct quote from covering their Nazi, Interpol, Hitler connections and making them look very moderate compared to Joe McCarthy. And they let this Joe McCarthy make up his list of names and scare lists. And then McCarthy's era was subdued when the Russians came out with a hydrogen bomb just at that time. And then they couldn't talk anymore about preventive wars because we were forced to accept the de-escalation of the Korean War into a no-win. And we were forced to do the same thing in Vietnam because the Soviet Union now had the hydrogen bomb. And while McCarthy was a mouthpiece for all of this, they couldn't let him continue any longer. And as I say, this paper put out by the Labor Caucus, this 20 or 30-page paper, alleges that McCarthy was sacrificed when he caught on to the dullest Rockefeller fascist link, and that's why he had to be discredited before the Congress and laughed at and removed from Congress and then suffered a death under strange circumstances. And I do have one book on the death of Joe McCarthy, written by Medford Evans. Max Eastman and Walter Lippmann worked with the Buckley faction. They helped set up the split against Leon Trotsky. They planted books saying that Lenin left a will against Trotsky, and then when Trotsky was murdered, they published literature against Trotsky and linked him to the Russians that were in power at the time. They helped the split between Trotsky and Stalin, which already did exist, and then played an instrumental part, according to this document, in killing Leon Trotsky. And of course, I think I've mentioned before on Dialogue Conspiracy that I had information several years ago, at least 5 or 6 years ago, that George de Mohrenschildt and Colonel Lawrence Orloff, two men that had visited with Marina Oswald in June of '62, were responsible for the killing of Trotsky. And if George de Mohrenschildt worked for William Buckley, and if this can of worms does link together to promote the Cold War and instigate cover stories for factual cases that didn't happen the way that these media sources present it, such as the National Review and Historic Societies, we can see a whole link of various conspiracies that are interrelated and manipulated by these powers using people, all kinds of people, not only the left but the right, and setting up in a tragic circumstance Joe McCarthy. You may not feel sorry for him for what he did, but he may have been induced or persuaded or told these were the circumstances, and he was only the puppet of the people like Rockefeller and the Buckleys. And as you study the history and you look back, it's very possible that this was happening. Well, I may do a little bit more on the Buckley next week and take some more news on the House Select Committee in Washington and some of the new documents they're coming up with, because people are asking me about those. Read your papers. They're interesting these days. There's a lot more coming out, and keep your ears open, and I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
You've been listening to Dialogue Conspiracy with Mae Brussell.